I'm joined on the Zoom by Ricardo Vaz from Venezuela Analysis. How are you doing, Ricardo?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me.
What I wanted to talk to you about, Ricardo, is that there's an article in The Guardian that was out in the last week, which kind of struck me because The Guardian has been clamoring for Rishi Sunak to go to COP27, as has the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. But there was this article that seemed to say that the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, should not be there. It says it's like asking an arsonist to put out a fire. Apparently, he's a climate offender and he has an abysmal environmental and human rights record. Have you seen this article?
Yes, I have seen it, and we at Venezuela Analysis, we wrote a Twitter thread on the article because I think it's a classic example of some of the dishonest reporting that is kind of traditional in the Western media and in corporate outlets, particularly when it comes to Venezuela. So it's a number of half-truths in a very biased way of reporting that kind of gets repeated over and over to create this narrative. I guess we can go through some of the details.
How
this mechanism works.
I mean, I've got some on screenshots. I'll just show you that the first one, the use of the word strongman, the South American strongman. That's obviously not that's quite an offensive term to make, and the basis of that use of that word is it says it's he has one of the Latin America's worst environmental and human rights records, and he made leaders at the summit visibly uncomfortable, puzzled analysts, including this guy Jeff Ramsey. I mean, if you start an article off saying that someone's a strongman and people are uncomfortable talking to him, we already get a flavour that he's not a good man, and then you're backed up by this guy Jeff Ramsey. Is Jeff Ramsey a good source?
I mean, it's a good source if you want to make this kind of argument. But Jeff Ramsey and the Washington office on Latin America in particular, they are a think tank based in the US that has been a very reliable source for all these pieces that want to attack not just Venezuela, but leftist governments in Latin America. So they offer a kind of progressive facade, but then in the end, they just end up endorsing foreign policy from the US in particular that attacks these governments in the South. And we can talk about the environmental issue in a bit, but the human rights records, of course, there are human rights issues in Venezuela, just like there are in all Latin American countries. But there has been a concerted effort based on mistruths and sometimes outright lies that has been repeated over and over to kind of demonize Maduro and the Venezuelan government. And this is no mystery. This is just a way to endorse regime change efforts.
I mean, there's another one in here. I mean, I want to just show these as they crop up in the article. I mean, the dictators. He's a dictator, but I mean, only looking on Wikipedia, he's elected, wasn't he? He's not. He didn't come in as a military dictator. That's what I'd associate the word dictator with.
Yeah, that's the thing, and that's what I found particularly dishonest about the article, because if you look at the headline, the arsonist claim, which we can discuss, he's actually quoting one of his sources, but dictator is actually coming from the author, and I find it surprising that he can just put this claim and that the editor would let it slip. This all stems from the 2018 election, as you were saying. He was elected, he won re-election in 2018, and this was a time when the Venezuelan opposition, the most hardline sectors that were already pushing for a coup at the time, they decided to boycott the election. In the end, some more moderate candidates ran against Maduro and lost. And so the hardline opposition, under strict instructions from Washington, decided to boycott the election, and with the help of the corporate media, create this narrative that the election was fraudulent, that it shouldn't be recognized. Of course, there was never any genuine effort to present evidence of fraud. I mean, Venezuela's electoral system was praised by Jimmy Carter and his organization as the best in the world back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. It has a lot of checks and balances. There's a paper ballot that's confronted against the electronic tally. So if you say there's fraud, there are plenty of steps along the way where these checks are made with all the participating political parties or political candidates in this case. So at one point, there should be a discrepancy between all these things that need to match. But of course, this is not the goal. The goal is just to establish this narrative and then justify attempts to overthrow the government, either by force or via economic pressure in the form of sanctions, which is also mentioned in this article.
So in 2018, the opposition didn't stand deliberately, so it would make the election seem less plausible. And then in 2019, this guy, Juan Guaidó, declared himself as the president without really, on the basis that I suppose that he said that 2018 wasn't valid, but the whole thing just sounds ridiculous. So can you tell us how confusing it was in 2019? This guy saying he's the president and he's not.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly very confusing, or more confusing for people outside Venezuela, because this guy just got up on a stage on January 23rd, 2019, and he said, I'm the interim president. This was, again, under instructions from Washington. There was, again, a big effort from the Western media to say that there is a kind of constitutional ground for him to do this, when in fact there isn't. If you look up the Constitution, we have a translated version on Venezuelanalysis. You look up the expression interim president, it's not there at any point. So it was really something made up on the spot, and something that continues up to this point, even though the efforts to oust the government fizzled out very quickly in the first 2 or 3 months. But this parallel structure continues to exist. It's still recognized by Washington, even though in the beginning there were some 60 countries, US allies, that recognized absurdly Guaidó as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. And then as time went on, most of them realized that this made no sense and it was just counterproductive, even from the point of view of ousting Maduro. And now it's just the US and a handful of countries left.
So is the reason he wasn't given much support and he lost support from other countries, the fact that nobody in Venezuela actually supported him?
He had support in the beginning from the traditional opposition sectors, but the whole operation hinged on there being a break in the armed forces, there being a military coup, or no, as some people in the opposition ranks themselves hoped for, a foreign invasion that would oust Maduro in I don't know, Panama style, like the US did in 1989. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. The Pentagon said very explicitly that this was a bad idea. It was floated, there were threats, but never really got close to happening. And there was an attempted coup in April 2019 with some sectors of the military, but it was very marginal and it didn't go anywhere. There was an attempt with mercenaries 1 year later. They disembarked here on the coast close to Caracas, and they had some idea that they were going to just march into the capital, kidnap Maduro, and do away with the government. That was neutralized very quickly. There were even 2 US mercenaries arrested there. They're still in jail. So that's the kind of thing that the recognized Venezuelan quote-unquote interim president was trying to do, either military coups or hiring mercenary firms to try and get to power.
That's terrifying. That's terrifying. And the fact that this Guardian, I mean, back to the article, I mean, this is what the article says. Maduro stubbornly clung to power, using security forces to clamp down on dissent. Doesn't sound like what you're describing at all. It sounds bizarre that you could say someone who's elected stubbornly clings to power. I mean, it's just, that is just beyond belief.
I find it, I mean, we have to find it amusing. It's actually very recurring, not just The Guardian. This kind of reporting appears everywhere, from the New York Times to Reuters to the Washington Post. And there is this idea that somehow Maduro is clinging on to power. And in fact, he has a constitutional mandate. He's serving a 6-year term. But it goes to show how closely aligned these major outlets are with Washington's interests. So at some point, Washington says, you know, Maduro is no longer the president. We recognize this other guy that no one had heard of before. The US Secretary of State at the time, Mike Pompeo, starts referring to Maduro as the former Venezuelan president. Wow. There were threats. John Bolton, for example, was very active on Twitter, and he was threatening the high-ranked Venezuelan military leader, saying, "Oh, you know, if you don't oust Maduro, there will be consequences." And somehow they expected this to happen. And then because it didn't,
I mean, it's incredible that it's not stubbornly. It's almost like he must have had some information. Maduro must have had information that they were planning this, but I mean, there's more. I mean, look at this paragraph here. After accepting the efforts to force Maduro out had failed, and that support for Guaido had fizzled, the global North is bringing the Venezuelan leader back in from the cold in the name of pragmatism, said Ramsey. Not the fact that he's actually the elected president, but they're kind of allowing him to come back into the fold. I mean, the Guardian it's incredible that the way they're talking about and it's someone who's faced an attempted coup.
But it goes to show that it's a slight contradiction, right? I mean, if he's not legitimate, if he's clinging on to power, why would you need to force him out, right? I mean, if you give up, it's because he's actually the one running things. And although I'll have to agree with Ramsey that it's in the name of pragmatism, there's no principles guiding U.S. foreign policy. It's just interests. So in this case, there's now the hotspot in Ukraine, and they're turning to Venezuela in the hopes that Venezuela can become an oil supplier and help bring down global oil prices. But they want to do that while maintaining this very harsh sanctions, especially against the oil industry, and this wasn't an accident. So they kind of want to have the cake and eat it at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, that's mentioned in here in the article. It says Washington is even discussing lifting some sanctions on Venezuela if Maduro holds free elections. I mean, they're sort of maintaining this idea that the elections were not democratic.
Yeah, and it's a very, sorry to interrupt you. It's a very biased way of putting. It's not Maduro who holds election. There's an electoral commission which is appointed by the National Assembly, and on one hand, and on the other, it was never really established that elections were not free. It was just repeated over and over, and now it's a basis for further claims. And in particular, as we saw in this paragraph, it becomes a kind of condition for lifting sanctions. So by doing that, you're assuming that the fact that you did not recognize the 2018 elections offers justification for imposing these unilateral measures that have had deadly consequences. Here, you read it and it looks like only Maduro is affected by them. But these measures, only in the first year, this was actually before, it began in 2017, and the Center for Economic and Policy Research, that's a DC-based think tank that has studied the issue, found that 40,000 people died in the first year as a consequence of sanctions. We can extrapolate based on that. Sanctions only got harsher after that. But what outlets like The Guardian do is use this narrative of electoral fraud or what have you, which wasn't never proven, but it was established by repetition, we could say, use it as justification for this measure that it amount to collective punishment. And these are not my words. It has been said by UN human rights experts and so on. So now they want to blackmail Maduro into offering concessions either to the opposition or to the US in exchange for lifting this measure, which are affecting the entire Venezuelan population.
I mean, the thing here that back on the article, which is obviously we've got to keep going back to the article. It says that Venezuela has the fastest accelerating rate of forest loss in Latin America, and much of the destruction is in the Orinoco mining arc, 110,000 square kilometer expanse of dense rainforest. This is the basis of the attack that inviting Maduro to COP27 is so bad because he's been knocking down trees. Now, I believe that there's a reason why he's been knocking down trees, and you can give an insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't mean to justify. There's been a lot of debate here in Venezuela about the environmental destruction brought by, for the most part, mining activities in this region, in the southeastern part of the country. But what we have to do is put this in context. So we had these US sanctions targeting the Venezuela's main source of income. So the oil industry was historically, until very recently, responsible for 90% of the country's foreign income. So these measures prohibit the US customers from buying. Those are primary sanctions, and there were secondary sanctions targeting foreign companies for buying Venezuelan oil, so kind of a global policeman role assumed by the US. And in these very difficult circumstances, the Venezuelan government turned to other sources of revenue, and in particular mining. Then the state-owned mining company was sanctioned itself, which forces this thing to go through more irregular and less supervised channels. I don't mean to justify it. Of course, there's profitable businesses and irregular groups that have proliferated in the area, but all of this should be measured against the background of economic aggression against Venezuela, where in normal circumstances, and even now with such high global oil prices, the government would be in a much better position to not have to rely on these kinds of activities to get revenue, and with that fund crucial things like food and medicine imports for the Venezuelan people.
And like you say, 45,000 people died as a result of the sanctions. So many more would have died if this hadn't been done. So to kind of make out he's sort of uncaring dictator when he's actually trying to save people's lives is pretty wide of the mark. Really, it's wide of the mark. Now, what do you feel about these propaganda attempts against Venezuela? Is this something that you're used to? Is this something that you think will continue on and on? What's your feeling about the way the Western media talk about South American regimes?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's nothing new, and Venezuelanalysis and myself in particular, we have made a living out of kind of demonstrating how the media works. We describe it as a very active participant in the efforts to attack any government that offers a kind of alternative path to capitalism. Of course, there's a lot to be said about the Maduro economic policies. That's a debate that warrants having, but it's clear that from the very beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, more than 20 years ago, the US was always hell-bent on overthrowing, because it understands it's a dangerous precedent in its quote-unquote backyard. So we have made an effort to try and explain to the public, especially the English-speaking public, how the media is working to justify these narratives that align themselves with US interests. We do it on Twitter. For as long as Twitter remains alive, we'll continue to do it. We've also written a lot on a website that's called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, that's specially dedicated to dissecting these biases in corporate media reporting when it comes to foreign things, not just Latin America, also China and Russia and so on. Wow. So yeah, I would recommend everyone follow Venezuelanalysis, visit our website to get another perspective on Venezuela on the ground. We are here in Venezuela, that will enlighten much more than whatever's being reported in Western media.